All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Today we're delighted to welcome Ramesh Srinivasan. Ramesh studies the intersection of technology, politics, and society. Since 2005, he's been a member of the faculty and professor at UCLA in the Information Studies Department. Prior to that, he took his PhD from Harvard, his master's from MIT, and his bachelor's from Stanford, and then went on to become a fellow at the MIT Media Lab and a teaching fellow at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. He's here today to discuss his first book, Whose Global Village? Rethinking How Technology Shapes Our World. The book is a sort of call to action to include marginalized non-Western countries in the digital revolution. And so, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming to Google, Ramesh Srinivasan.
Thank you. All right, it's absolutely a pleasure to be here. I have a bunch of friends at Google, two of whom are here, and my new friend David. I wanted to thank you all for making the time to listen to some of these thoughts. What I'm going to do is set a timer, and I'm going to go about 45 minutes, maybe even less, and then we'll have a conversation about this material. So what you can do also is, if there are thoughts or reactions or comments that you have to any of this material, by all means, you can tweet about it and link it to me, and we can have a kind of asynchronous conversation afterward. And you can also get in touch with me through my email address and my website, which are listed on this link right here. Okay, so many of us know what this diagram represents, but let me kind of unpack it a little bit. This represents the fiber optic cable infrastructure that provides sort of the backhaul, if you will, the very basis of what the internet is. And many of us think about how this sort of environment and this landscape is shifting. But it's very important to note when you see diagrams like this that the internet is actually not immaterial, but it's actually material. It's rooted in the things we build and the places we connect. But what's also striking when you see a diagram like this is how the networks that are actually drawn by fiber optic cables that represent the internet, and there's also, of course, satellites that are part of the internet as well, represent the places that are already, in a sense, very well connected in our world today, right? So if you look at a map, for example, of plane flights, you'll see that there'll be some pretty high correlation between plane flights and other forms of traffic and exchange and these mappings as well. So that explains why we see the west coast of the United States, for example, well connected with Shanghai and Beijing in this map. It also explains why we see New York City well connected with London and Western Europe. But what's particularly notable when you look at this diagram is what is not connected and what is not connected to what. Particularly speaking, that we're talking about just a couple fiber optic cables that connect the two major continents of the global south, right? That of Africa and South America. So what that means is this sort of global village, so to speak, which is partly the title of my book, the term in my book, is not actually come to be. That if anything, this vision that Marshall McLuhan and many others had of sort of an internet that brings everybody together in equitable and flattened and democratic fashions has not really been the experience on a very, very material and specific level itself. So to kind of continue, let's think about one of the major metaphors by which we think about the internet today, and that we think about data today more broadly, which is the cloud, right? So as we all know, as we think about the role of metaphor in our lives, metaphors both open up our understandings, but in some cases they also close our understandings, right? So when you think about the cloud, you say, hey, who has a problem with the cloud? A cloud is immaterial. A cloud is made of water. Our bodies are made of water. Clouds are everywhere, right? Who has a problem with the cloud itself? But of course, as we all know here at Google, but we also know in other companies, the cloud is very much transacted and determined by a few companies and their terms of service in relation to personal data, right? And so the reason I have these 3 logos here on this map, including your own, is because in the country of Mexico, and I'll speak about this very briefly in this talk today, where I'm currently doing my field work, it's really fascinating. There have been some informal studies done, but emails and various forms of specific communication that are sent between one neighbor and their neighbor just next to them are often forms of data that are transacted on cloud-based servers through these 3 companies. So we all know this, but if you send an email to someone who's right next to you, that email might actually go through a server that's outside your country and that is part of a private corporate kind of proprietary terms of service. So I think it's important to read our experiences of the internet more largely, and data as well, through the specific mechanisms by which it's transacted and arranged. The reason why I say that is we're at an incredibly staggering moment, I would argue an inflection point, and how we think about everything from how money is made to how labor is accumulated to how services are drawn, right? We're at a point right now where platforms, and specifically the so-called looseness or flexibility of platform infrastructures, mean everything, right? So you think about these particular examples, and you can substitute very easily Alibaba, right? The retailer one that in yellow there, with Amazon as well. And you can actually realize that ownership and labor are actually, in a large sense, something of the past, right? Incredible amounts of money are accumulated simply by being some sort of transactional agent online. And I think that that is really, really important because that, of course, is brilliant. It's disruptive. It's an example of an incredibly creative and efficient technological advancement, but it also has massive, massive, massive social and economic effects. And we need to be responsible and aware of those effects. So I'm very happy to know that there's increasingly a movement toward ethics in AI and ethics in algorithms and ethics in thinking about the effects of technology, not just when you click on something, but more rooted in our societies. And we can see that from everything from our rent prices in San Francisco to these sorts of questions about labor and the independent gig economy, right? So I want you to just kind of keep this thought in mind as we think again about how not only the cloud has very specific transactional arrangements that are associated with companies, but also our experiences of taking taxis, staying in houses, sharing media content via Facebook, for example. Those are also all transacted by platforms that are accruing a great amount of money and power. So the reason why I'm getting into all this is because we're building systems right now here at Google, and of course in many other capacities, many other companies that are so-called learning from the world, right? And as my colleague Kathy O'Neill says in her recent book called Weapons of Math Destruction, generally speaking, and you all know this better than I do, when you create an algorithm, you're basically thinking about what is the recipe and what is the success, right? You're thinking about the set of instructions by which some sort of deterministic or successful outcome can be programmed or created, right? And so the reason that that is problematic, and this is sort of a sad but kind of humorous example around this, is if we are building systems that people, generally speaking, treat as neutral and natural, because none of us have any time anymore, right? We're all completely multitasking. And the technologies allow us to do that, but they also put us in a position where our minds, we sort of blindly trust that which we see, right? But if those systems are learning from a world that already features various forms of bias, and there's quite a bit of science that shows that at the minimum, racial implicit bias is the norm rather than the exception, then those systems are going to create outputs that we might treat as neutral that actually reflect those biases and normalize those biases, right? So generally speaking, you all know this again. What we end up creating algorithmically is based on who we are and what we design and what software we build, right? The kind of learning model that we apply and kind of our ability to design that learning model and the data sets, of course, by which that learning model is learning and the outcomes for which we are optimizing those algorithmic systems. So this is sort of a, again, kind of a weird and humorous example of a company out of Russia called FaceApp. I don't know how many of you heard of this. Out of St. Petersburg in Russia, that was attempting to go through the internet and take people's faces and make them more attractive. So I think most people think that President Obama is pretty attractive, right? At least in 2008, right? Until he had to age by being president of this country. And so President Obama's face, right, we know he's mixed race, but President Obama's face was turned white by this algorithmic system. I'm not really sure he looks that much better thanks to the system than not. Okay, so now I want to kind of touch on other issues just to kind of push these ideas and kind of engage with you in a conversation around these issues. I don't know how many of you read this article, but it's quite persuasive for me, published by the outlet ProPublica. And this is a really, really interesting issue where a private company was charged with building a system that could predict, in theory, the rate of recidivism. So what does recidivism? Recidivism means you committed a crime. What are the chances that you're going to commit a crime again, right? And what it turned out in this particular case, and this company is called NorthPoint, in this particular case is the Caucasian man on the right who actually had a felony conviction already on his record was at a 70% rate less predicted. So the black man was basically predicted with a 70% higher rate to commit a crime again than the white man. And the black man did not have a felony conviction on his record. Now, the systems themselves are not directly trained on racial issues. So it's important to point that out. This is far more implicit and pervasive as a form of learning phenomenon than actually saying, oh, you're black, therefore you're going to commit a crime again. They were asking people other questions like, was one of your parents ever sent to jail or to prison? How many of your friends and acquaintances are taking drugs illegally? Not sure why they answered that question correctly. Or how often did you get in fights while at school, right? And we know environmental factors are correlated with racial factors that might allow this gentleman on the left to answer yes to some of those questions and this gentleman on the right to answer no to these questions. So this is a huge issue because increasingly more and more states and cities themselves, as I'm going to show in just a moment, are actually applying various sorts of technological systems in theory to overcome human bias, right? And in many cases, it is true. Humans are biased, right? But the problem is that systems that we're treating as neutral and natural are actually complex reflections of those forms of bias in highly inductive and environmental manners. So this is something that you all at Google, most powerful technology company in the world in my mind, you guys got to do something about this. Help us with these issues because the impacts of what you do are profound. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of Google's projects in relation to this space as well. Okay. So this is another example that's made the rounds. This is actually research done by a colleague of mine at the UCLA anthropology department, who's built neural network machine learning models for the Iraq battlefield. He had Pentagon-funded research. He also was building learning models based on archaeological data. And now there's an attempt to apply some of these kind of, if you will, learning ontological models to the theme of predictive policing. And I think all of us have seen Minority Report. So we know this idea of predicting whether a given crime, in this particular case, is gang-related or not, right? And we all know that gang-related itself is a quite murky definition, right? Like what is and is not considered a gang? Is it simply a yes or no? Are there gangs that might be construed more as communities, or are there gangs that are actually violent and a threat to society? So this is actually being potentially implemented by the Los Angeles Police Department, right where I live, in Los Angeles, a predictive policing system. Again, that will, what this will do is it will be fed crime reports. It will actually develop, it's called partially generative research, partially generative algorithms. And in the absence of a written description, the neural network will generate new text, an algorithmically written crime report that isn't actually read by anyone, but is supposed to provide context to a police report, and then is turned into a mathematical vector that will relate to the prediction of whether a crime is gang-related or not. And so, of course, as you can imagine, and I'm kind of implying here I don't even know if I'm implying, I've been pretty clear, this to me is problematic because it doesn't really consider all these sort of qualitative social issues in the construction of an algorithm, let alone considers how such an algorithm might be regulated, how there might be oversight, how it might be checked, the checks and balances, and so on. So often I get the response to this, well, people are biased, judges are biased, the police department is biased. No question about it at all. But for me, setting this up as kind of algorithmic bias or human bias is a bit of a false positive, right? It's a false comparison. The question is what kinds of technologies should we aspire toward? What kinds of relationships between humans and machines are ethical and healthy for us in our society? Everything from labor to questions of criminality to questions of racial bias, which I know none of us really want to perpetuate, right? One of the junior authors to this research with Jeff Brantingham, my colleague, presented this research before this kind of made the rounds in the media, and he was asked quite a few critical questions, if you will, and he left the room saying, kind of ran out of the room saying, "I'm just an engineer," right? But as we all know, and you know, this is part of our engineering education. We're seeing a movement toward ethics courses in our AI classes as well, to integrate the two. And other colleagues are saying we should integrate moral philosophy classes with computational sciences classes or anthropological classes with computer science classes. I would love to co-teach classes like this at UCLA. And we struggle to do this, frankly. This is a pervasive issue. But we know that we're not simply engineers, that what we're building has massive impacts on society, and what we build has a lot to do with the cultures, not only of ourselves, but the organizations of which we're part. You know, we all know that, right? So I guess I just want to kind of use these examples to talk about the world that we're constructing right now and what happens when we give private organizations that are quite secretive because they have intellectual property and copyright issues all the power in public life, right? There's that blurring. And I think, to my next point, this is why so many people are upset at Facebook today. Okay. So this is research that actually informed some of the algorithms that were used by Cambridge Analytica. I don't think I need to introduce Cambridge Analytica to this crowd. I've been able to do some interviews with them for my new book. I'll talk about that in a moment. But this relates to research done by a scholar at the Stanford Business School right up the street. Highly recommend you having him here. He's a very nice guy named Michal Kozinski. And Michal has made the argument, and it was a real barn burner when I brought him to my university for people to ask him some questions, that with 10 likes, this is on Facebook, a computer knows you better than a colleague. With 70 likes, it knows you better than a friend or a roommate. 150 better than a family member. And 300 likes, it knows you better than a spouse. But it's not simply about likes on Facebook, because, you know, to be honest, I don't think my sort of lens to my personality is that well revealed through Facebook. There's a lot of things I believe that I don't share on Facebook, and may not even be that implicit. But it's the aggregation of data. So what we think of as disaggregated activities in our lives are being aggregated. They're being brought together, right? I never thought that what I might buy at Rite Aid would somehow have any relationship to what I post or like or comment when I connect with Alex on Facebook, right? Or with Matt on Facebook, both my Facebook friends, right? So I think that those parts of my life are independent of one another as a human being. I think that I want the right to be who I am, where I am. When I go home, I'd like to be who I am in a different way, in a different fashion than I am when I'm here right now. Who I am in front of my mother is different than who I am in front of my friends, right? I'm kind of the same person, but still. My mom's right here. So these are I think these are things that are really, really important to kind of consider, right? Like the power over our own agency as human beings. And more generally, the idea of knowing someone true. That's true that on some sort of snapshot in a specific set of activities, I might be able to predict one's behavior. But shouldn't I have the power to change? Should I have systems that reinforce certain types of behavior, feeding me information that then I have no power to necessarily overcome? Because we all are conditioned by systems of all forms, not just technological ones, school systems, etc., policing systems, governmental systems that influence us in our lives. We are socialized by the systems of which we're part. To think that people somehow can overcome those forms of conditioning is naive, right? So the question for me is are multiple questions about morality, about ethics, and about the agency of us as human beings. So what I'm getting at is sort of a set of these issues that we're starting to normalize in our lives. And I'm going to give you kind of two very quick final examples of this. This is a story that's made the rounds based on original research that was published in Science, which is like the dream for all of us to publish in the journal Science. This is related to the word embedding algorithm. I don't know how many of you know about this research, but it's very much worth knowing. So this research has been built into automated systems that are being piloted by various companies for human resources labor. As we all know, automated labor, or at least semi-automated labor, through computational systems are going to replace, if not supplant, or perhaps create new opportunities, I hope, for people's jobs. At the end of the day, we need to be building technologies that serve all of us as human beings, even on a kind of company-based level, right? We shouldn't be losing people in our jobs unless the goal is to lose people and cut costs, right? So what these systems were doing, word embedding in particular, has had a 50% bias on its CV scanning between African Americans' names and Caucasian names, even when the CVs are normalized around other variables for being more or less equivalent in terms of their level of quality. I mean, how that's even done is a very interesting question. But what is essentially happening is, again, not a problem necessarily with the system itself, but what it's learning from and the overall environment around which it's kind of computing, right? So words, so for example, words in this system, and in generally in corpus of English language, like female and woman are more closely associated with arts and humanities. Surprise, surprise. White, while male and man were closer to math and engineering professions. European American names, in terms of the outputs of these systems, were more closely associated with words like gift and happy. And African American names were more commonly associated with unpleasant words. So the issue is that unless algorithms are explicitly programmed to address some of these issues, they're going to be riddled with the same social prejudices, right? And so the question really is, how do we do better? 840 billion words were used to train this system, and it was providing these types of outputs. So, what's going on here? Well, 4 or 5 factors that I want to identify. First, questions of diversity and inclusion, which is really central to this book that you now have in your hands, around the design and engineering of technologies. Second, our data sets, as I mentioned already. What kinds of data sets are these systems learning from? Third, and this is really central to my work, the ontological learning models. That's a fancy term. What do I mean by that? When I say I know something, how do I articulate that which I know? When I say I believe something, that's epistemological. When I want to articulate that knowledge, that's ontological, how I express. So similarly, the systems we build can be built with particular learning models that might be more inclusive, where people who might be targeted or unfairly excluded by such systems can be part of the process of designing and developing such systems, etc. And then I also really believe that we need independent oversight, particularly when these are privatized services being used in public contexts, right? And the best example of all is obviously our election, right? And elections across the world. So I'm writing in my new book about examples like this from Myanmar, Sri Lanka, India, the Philippines with Rodrigo Duterte and the cyber troops issue. All of these issues, right? And a lot of this implicates Facebook. But of course, since you're building a technology, many technologies that are accessed by 2+ billion people, you guys should tell me the actual numbers. I think it's 2+ billion people. All I do is scrape journalism, right? Pretty impactful stuff. So we're going to have to think about what are the values, right, that influence how we build systems. And how do we think about the other, especially because the places where Google and Facebook and other big companies are going to expand in their reach are, guess what? Of course, the global south, right? Places where there are more people, higher density of population, less connected, right? But who are those people? How do we understand them not just as users, but as people who have voices and values and certain histories and things to say to us, Like that they're living, they can express and communicate with us as we build and design such systems and as we think about the effects that those systems pose. So the reason I show this one is I think this one made the round, but of course there's also a little bit of a movement here in Silicon Valley, and I've interviewed Sam Altman from Y Combinator about this for my new book and a couple other folks. concerned about this kind of super intelligence that might be emerging on a recursive level as various sorts of algorithmic systems start to learn not only internally and develop their own sorts of forms of complex adaptive behavior, but they learn from one another. I think this was totally overhyped. It was basically an interface language that was developed between two AI bot systems. I don't know if you know this story, but I still think that it speaks to all the different ways in which we're talking about and thinking about AI, and it means a lot of different things, right? Automation is not the same as AI. Specialized AI is different than generalized AI. AI and biases, like the examples I gave earlier, is different than this kind of AI. So these are all things that are worth thinking through in my mind. So of all people, my favorite, Tucker Carlson, that's a joke, is I'm showing my biases, that's fine. We all should just show our biases, right? Has actually been speaking to cognitive scientists. He is concerned about the effects of the centralization of power around technology on our political system, because he's such a great patriot, right? So he interviewed a colleague of mine who has been quite critical of Google, full disclosure, named Robert Epstein. And Epstein's research has been looking at search results in large-scale controlled studies in different parts of the world, Australia, India, and the United States. And he's been doing really, really interesting work. And he published one piece in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And he was the head of Psychology Today. And what this research showed, and this might be very interesting to you, that if you searched for political issues with Google search results, simple masking of the ordering of those results could flip undecided voters from 50-50 to 90-10. Let me explain what that means. So Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump. Let's say they were both, I'm totally undecided between the two of them. And I have, Trump at 1 and 3 and Hillary at 2 and 4. I could flip it from that to Hillary 1 and 3, Trump 2 and 4, 50-50 to 90-10. So that's really, really interesting. Did that make sense? Basically, how you order, even if it seems sort of not necessarily that significant, could actually largely affect people's voting, their biases toward voting. So I think that's a significant issue because, again, that's a sort of transgression into the public space. And one of the most famous examples of this from a few years ago, you all may remember this, was Facebook's A/B testing on the get out the vote button. Do you all remember this? So they kind of said, I voted, like click on this, right? Remember, David? It's like, click on this to say, like, I voted and share this with your friends. So it turned out that influenced Facebook users who were seeing that, right, the A group, to vote at a 0.5% higher rate, which doesn't seem like a lot, but we all know when we're talking about millions of people, that's very, very significant. So simply Facebook saying, I voted, will push voting to that significant an extent. And we know that those numbers are way, way higher than the amounts by which Trump won in Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. In fact, put together. I just recently looked at those numbers. So we know, to me that's not necessarily a critique of Facebook, but it's meant to understand that these platforms have profound impact on our behavior. So this is all to kind of get at some of the work that I've been doing in this space. So when this book came out that you have in your hands, I started to make the rounds. I think it's because I was concerned about some of these global and cultural, and even these blurring into like political and economic questions that I've already brought up in this introduction. So of all people, Morning Joe, MSNBC's Morning Joe, had me on like 2 or 3 weeks right after the election. And Mika Brzezinski, I literally saw her jaw drop in front of me when I spoke about concerns with groups like Cambridge Analytica, right? How when you create sort of so-called open ecosystems for advertisers, but closed off for users, you can have these pernicious effects on our democracy, or what we fight for and aspire to in a democracy. And of course, this is not simply an issue with Cambridge Analytica. It's far more pervasive with Russia and other examples like this, right? And really, it's not really even about the effects that these folks have on our elections. We're not really sure with Cambridge Analytica. I've yet to see a solid piece of research to show that Cambridge Analytica actually affected the election. And Cambridge Analytica's content is not the same as fake news. It's more like framed news based on psychometrics, right? Like Mihal's work, he was influential there. He's not happy about it, but still. So this is also, meant to make the point that we also need to understand as we design and build systems, what we value in terms of advertisers versus users, right? And how do we balance those? How do we think about not just short-term effects of the technologies that we build, but also these kind of systemic effects on our larger political systems? And I think that that's really, really important, and I'm appreciative that a number of folks from Google were working with the Obama administration afterward and helping advise them around this. And I hope that, that there's a devotion to public and civic life and democratic ideals from our tech companies, because you all are really powerful, So, all right. So my colleague Zeynep Tufekci has been making the rounds. Some of you might know her work. She's a quite public critic of what's going on these days. She, in particular, has been concerned about some algorithms that have been populating YouTube in particular, especially like the recommendation systems. I've yet to see very strong empirical work showing that the auto-suggestion, is it called auto-suggestion? Auto-suggestion feature of YouTube actually impacts one's perceptions, but it's hard not to believe that that is the case, because I'll speak for myself and speak for some cognitive science studies showing that what we see impacts what we believe. But Tufekci's critiques, which I'm sure have been heard here, are that, maybe not here, but at YouTube, are of her own experiences, and it is anecdotal rather than large-scale quantitative evidence, and I think that that's important to note. She's, was like, let me watch some Make America Great Again rallies on YouTube, and then she makes the point that she started to see more and more radicalized content, right? So like what was suggested after seeing a Make America Great Again Donald Trump rally might have been content that was a bit more alt-right or white nationalist or, heaven forbid, neo-Nazi, right? And of course, it has nothing to do with Facebook, Google, any other company being pro-alt-right. Of course not, right? If anything, as we saw with some of the interrogations of Mark Zuckerberg by our Congress, who don't seem to understand technology very well, at least the ones who, at least in the Senate generally. I don't know why their staffers weren't schooling them on some basic concepts of computing. But anyway, as we saw, the Republicans really, really did not like Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, they admired, I think, his wealth. But it didn't look like they really liked him very much. And that's because, generally speaking, we are seeing that Silicon Valley tends to be more Democrat, of these two parties. That's just sort of been the case historically. So I guess the question is how do we sort of optimize, again, recommendation systems, in this case with YouTube, to balance, again, the goal of maintaining attention, as my colleague Tim Wu points out in his excellent book, The Attention Merchants, which he describes Google within this as well, and therefore the gathering of data and click-throughs and so on, with what might be, if you will, a vegetable. I like my information junk food. We all do, right? Like I like my French fries, but I also want that salad. Or maybe I don't want that salad. I want that salad after I eat it, and I need that salad, right? So this is kind of a point that's been really built into a lot of the conversations that we've had about technology for quite a bit of time, including work by my colleague Eli Pariser and his work, The Filter Bubble, several years ago, that even Obama referred to in his interview with David Letterman that was up on Netflix. So these are examples of these effects in different parts of the world. I won't go too much into this. In Sri Lanka, Facebook was using similar techniques, I suppose, to privilege more hysterical content. There's not a strong independent journalistic media. There are not very strong governmental institutions in Sri Lanka that can regulate and push this back. And that actually created real-world violence. This is a New York Times article that came out fairly recently. So these battles are very significant, not just about data and attention, but also about the internet itself. This is me on Joy Reid a few weeks ago, actually a couple months ago, talking about net neutrality itself, right? And so there's some conversations, which I'm very happy that Google supports net neutrality, but there are conversations even about that, because at this point, many, many different forms of our democratic activities, especially including online, are under attack. So I wrote a piece when my book came out, concerned about some of these issues, and I made the very simple point that how we learn about others culturally is very determined by the instruments of search and what we see in terms of the ordering and filtering of search results that then influence how we know and understand one another. And we even know with Wikipedia, I don't know if you know this research, that it tends to still be very asymmetrically authored by men, and specifically men from Europe and North America. And that's generally a story of technology at this point, right? But it doesn't have to be that way. So I give the very simple example in this article I wrote for Quartz, and also in my book itself, that we can do something better about this. One way and the example I give is of the country, just kind of random, of the country Cameroon in West Africa. I was invited by UNESCO to visit that country, and I searched for Cameroon. Of course, I use Google like everybody, and the first couple results I get on Google, in fact, in my first page of search results, I didn't see a single web page from Cameroon, which is actually pretty high internet penetration rate, quite educated, and Anglophone and Francophone. So it's not just a Francophone country. So why was it that I was seeing that? I thought Google might know me better. But in this particular case, I was seeing content that likely was correlated to that which was more popular and validated perhaps by PageRank and various forms of backlinking, mass validation, which is not a problematic concept in my mind. But mass validation is not always what should count as knowledge, and we know what comes up in our search results essentially are treated as truth and knowledge by a large percentage of users, and in many cases by myself. So I kind of am concerned with these issues. I write about these issues in this book and in my second book, which came out with my colleague Adam Fish, where we write about kind of hacker examples and the Silk Road and the Pirate Party and Iceland. These are all things you can ask me about later. And even the examples of powerful uses of technology in the context of the Arab Spring. I did my fieldwork, this is kind of after I wrote this first book, in Egypt in the middle of the Arab Spring, looking at what people were doing with technology, old and new, not just new technology, also old technologies, and using projectors, using bed sheets, taking stuff that they saw on YouTube and projecting it into public spaces. And all of this is really, really powerful and has great promise. One of the major arguments I make in the book that I spoke about earlier, I referred to earlier, is this concept of ontology. I describe it basically in chapter 1, but I really elaborate it in chapter 3 and chapter 4, based on fieldwork that I did collaboratively from about 2002 to about 2014 with various Native American populations, where I was thinking about how do I build systems from languages to databases to algorithms to interfaces that those communities themselves, who are my partners, could help design with me. And I'm not nearly the engineer that most of you are, and I'm not nearly the engineer that Google is as a whole, but I was attempting to deal with some of these issues and think about some of these issues in the context of trying to support communities who are on the other side of the digital divide, and certainly simply being connected to the internet is not good enough to actually support their voices and their agendas, especially people who are, in many cases, have had a great deal of cultural and political trauma. So one example I give in chapter 3 of the book is an ontology that I designed with these communities, something like what we call in information studies an information architecture. So folks in these communities were building, this was a project I did with 19 Native American reservations between 2003 and 2005. It's described in chapter 3 of the book. And in that part of the book, I describe how these communities are attempting to take advantage of this internet infrastructure that they have built and owned with the help of Hewlett-Packard, and actually build a system for them to communicate with one another and to build their own local economies and preserve culture, etc. And so they were building and designing this system according to this architecture. Again, pretty hierarchical, but they were naming categories back when we used to think about tagging and Web 2.0 and all this kind of like what Tim O'Reilly wrote about back in the day. And they were basically putting content and sharing it with one another and deciding what categories were relevant and how those categories would be related to one another. So what this is the power of naming and giving people the opportunity to classify their own corpuses, if you will, within their communication systems to support, hopefully, one another. Another example I give in the book in a large amount of detail in chapter 4 is of work I did with the Zuni. This has all been funded by the National Science Foundation. And in this work, I describe what happens when a group of people in a Native American community in New Mexico are able to build and design, with my help, a digital museum system where they can actually get access to images of objects that were taken from their communities that are sitting in museums all over the world. And this is another huge part and promise of the internet, the recovery and hopefully promotion of cultural heritage projects, which I'm also very interested in. And one of the coolest parts of the book is this story I tell toward the end of chapter 4 of the Zuni coming together to look at this system that we've built where 1,500 approximately objects from different museums are now being made available to them as images. And look what's happening here. It's not one person per computer, and it's not this kind of individualized experience. To look at an object, the whole community and different folks within the community of different age groups and different what we call kiva or kinship groups come together. And as they're looking at an object, in this particular case, I'm talking about a project called the anahoho, an image of an anahoho, which is like a kachina. People are putting their fingers in their ears, and other people are leaving the room. Other people from other parts of the community are coming in the room. And that's because knowledge at Zuni is really based on who you are in the community. And I want to make that point to make the point that as we think about Google in relation to diverse cultures in different parts of the world, we have to understand those cultural norms and values that are part of what people know and how people share information. And that's a really important ethical question as well. So the reason people were putting their fingers in their ears is they were not yet at the point in the community in terms of like kind of a, what do you call that, like a ceremonial sort of, kind of becoming initiation, right? To actually know that knowledge, right? And at different points, so looking at one object and getting them to share information for themselves and with the museums took like 1.5 hours. And they would change the languages with which they would speak about the object. So it's really, really powerful. To me, this is an example of technology as a catalyst for a culture as it is, right? And so my book is not just critical, but it's really concerned with these questions of how can we develop and build technologies that serve people, that serve the economic and political and cultural interests of those communities. So just to kind of like quickly wrap up, this is perhaps like the coolest project in the world that I'm working on right now. I'm like really excited about this. This is work I'm doing with the group Rhizomatica, who by the way recently won a Google Prize. So thank you for supporting them. They are the largest community-owned cell phone network in the world in southern Mexico. They're in the mountains all around Oaxaca, which is like a magical, magical place. One of the most biodiverse and culturally diverse parts of the world. Dozens of Zapotec, Mixtec, and Mixe languages. And these communities were not served by big telecom, specifically Carlos Slim and Telcel, who's one of the richest guys in the world, right? So they said, hey, we want these communication rights. Our constitution legitimates the communication rights for indigenous peoples in Mexico. We're going to build our own networks. So they are building their own collectively owned networks. And we see examples of that in the context also of net neutrality here in the United States, in places like Detroit and Red Hook and Brooklyn, in other parts of the world as well. The largest kind of collectively owned internet network, mesh network in the world right now is a place called Wi-Fi Net in Catalonia. And Wi-Fi is how they say Wi-Fi. So I think that's really funny. So this is really, really an amazing project. I've been doing ethnographic work out in these mountain regions, looking at how these networks are being built, what's produced out of collective ownership. Does it support people's economies? How does it support people who speak languages that have never been written because of colonial histories? All of this, right? What can emerge out of the rhizome, the rhizomatica, the rhizome that is this project, right? So the project's called Rhizomatica. In Spanish, they also call it Teléfono Indígena Comunitaria, indigenous community telephones. So it's a really, really amazing example of how not just we as human beings, but our communities themselves can take power over technology. And as I said, it's really cool that Google has been supporting this project without trying to own it or own its data. So I think that that's to your credit. So the last thing I'll just mention really briefly is I'm starting to write, this is for my new book, my third book I'm working on right now, which will be a trade book with MIT Press called, I think I'm going to call it We the Users. And I'm writing about examples of how we can head into a technology future that is human and collective, that makes sure people have enough money, make sure people have portable health benefits. So in this context, I've been talking to people also like Sam Altman from Y Combinator about the universal basic income movement. I did a really cool, so I've looked at this example from Sweden. I did a really cool interview with this guy who's a Stanford graduate, one of the youngest major city mayors in the country. I interviewed him yesterday, Michael Tubbs. He was on the Bill Maher show just like 2 weeks ago. And Michael is only 27 years old. He's a Stanford Rhodes Scholar, comes from a single family home. His mother was near the poverty line, and he's implementing the Universal Basic Income Project with the help of some folks connected to the Obama administration. Actually, Google's been kind of on the side involved with this to try to think about what happens when you give people, poor people, especially in Stockton, $500 a month. What do they do with the money, right? And as an experiment, not necessarily as some sort of legitimate path forward, but as an experiment itself. So these are a couple of the things I'm writing about. In my new book, I'm writing about where we can go to kind of balance flexibility, creativity, innovation as it's defined here in Silicon Valley with innovation in relation to people and their lives, and really more than anything, the implications of all this on our world in terms of political equality and democracy, economic equality, and really allowing our diverse world to maintain its diversity through the technologies we build, right? Rather than flatten or reduce that diversity. I think all three of those, I'm kind of overwhelmed because I'm trying to write about all three at the same time. And I've had an opportunity to talk to some really important and major figures. Vicente Fox, the former president of Mexico. I'm talking to David Axelrod from Obama 2008 and 2012 and on CNN next week. Van Jones, other folks, Elizabeth Warren. I've had a chance to get these people's voices very briefly in the book itself. And also a number of folks here in Silicon Valley. I spoke to the head of diversity inclusion here at Google. You're the only major tech company that's talked to me so far, so thank you. Thank you for that. And I'm also writing about examples, not just like these of Michael and the Swedish example, but also of the AI lab in Makerere University in Uganda, which is so interesting. It's an example of a company, an AI laboratory that's attempting to build artificial intelligence models that are somehow supportive of Ugandan interests, but also are seeded with Ugandan data, as well as built around learning models that are hopefully expressive of the cultures and communities of Uganda itself. So this is a whole body of work. I would love to come back and share more from this new book when it comes out. And I'm really excited to get some of your feedback and thoughts on all of this. I tried to throw a lot at you, but that's because I am really excited to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you for having me.
Okay, I actually have a question. So
Sure.
you mentioned the power of these algorithms, because of the scale that they have.
Yeah.
And so when you take that into account and then also take into account the inevitable fallibility of humans who are creating them,
Yeah.
what can companies do to hold themselves accountable ethically, maybe by training its employees a certain way, or whether there needs to be some sort of auditing process? Have you thought about, should that be, should the onus for that be on the companies themselves, or should it be government? Maybe just talk a little bit about that.
No, thank you for asking that. I mean, I appreciate the sympathy for what I'm trying to say in that question. Absolutely. I think that there not only should be kind of internal auditing processes. I think one of the more brilliant design companies here in Silicon Valley was IDEO, and they were really smart for having anthropologists and sociologists in the room with their engineers and their designers. And I think that having teams that are more inclusive and multidisciplinary in the design and kind of engineering and even evaluation process is really important. I think that one proposal I've had that I've been talking about for the last year or two is even giving folks an opportunity on a heuristic level, right, like a descriptive level, of helping them understand why they see what they see, right? I understand you can't give up private software code, right? And I don't think people are interested in that, nor would they even understand it, right? I don't think almost any of us would, right? But at the same time, you can explain to people, this is optimized for this output, and here are some other options in terms of what you could see based on other sorts of, if you will, language or values by which something is optimized for. But I also believe when we talk about technologies that are kind of blurred into other realms, right? Like into our political lives, into our educational systems, into our criminal policing and justice systems, economic systems, there has to be some sort of third party, not necessarily regulating as much as coordinating to ensure that there are checks throughout this process to ensure that we do not legitimate or naturalize the biases that we have, especially not even on an individual level, but on a level that is collective and institutional. And that's why I tried to talk about these more collective examples first, like the policing example, like the ProPublica article, before I talked about what Zeynep was saying about kind of the YouTube algorithm. Because I think it's far more pernicious, these collective implementations, than just the kind of individual radicalized content. Because I've seen radicalized content online. I don't mind looking at that. I don't think that transforms me necessarily. But I think on a larger scale level, it's an issue.
So I guess I actually just want to build off of what's already been asked and what's been answered, because I think when Mark Zuckerberg first gave his interview after the whole Facebook, Russia, Cambridge Analytica scandal, the summary was, who knew? I had no idea Facebook would ever do this. And that seems to be a pretty common critique of technocrats, of CEOs of tech companies, that they break first and then think about the consequences later. And I think that cycle is further exacerbated by the fact that a lot of these companies are going public really quickly and are essentially pushed to grow and grow and grow. And so you'll see companies like Facebook and Apple and Google try to break into China for the sake of growth, for the sake of revenue. Not necessarily for the sake of inclusion, I think, but for the sake of money.
Sure.
And so how do we impose some kind of, not necessarily regulation like you said, but like some kind of like just balance, some check to essentially guard for these biases, for this desire for growth, as opposed to like inclusion and diversity and, you know, corrections for algorithmic biases in ML models and things similar.
Yeah, what a great question. And also it allows me to mention one other idea I had, which is giving people the opportunity to visualize why they see what they see and choose alternatives, right? Like a lot of us as designers used to build and design systems that were visually based, that were kind of multivariate in their kind of scope, and we could think about that. So let me answer your question. It's an incredibly difficult issue, right? Because, you know, Tim O'Reilly makes the point that the master algorithm of all is market cap valuation, right? And it's an interesting point for a father figure in computer science to say that, right? He was made a lot of money off of his own publishing industry. I think that we have to figure out ways to experiment with other models to see what, and we can do this in a kind of small scale, lightweight fashion, we being folks in these in companies like yourselves, to see if they are actually creating returns that are similar or perhaps even close to the current model, right? So I've been looking at some research that's showing that you can build very persuasive, very strong engagement products with more diverse design teams. That even having diversity in terms of VC investment could actually incubate highly lucrative and profitable industries as well. Of course, it's difficult to want to break something or even tinker with something that is so wildly successful. And I would say Google is nothing if not successful, right, in terms of that level. However, move fast and break things, right, which is kind of a casual motto, right, that Facebook embraced. And you know, and we get it. Like I'm a former engineer, right? Like that's just meant in that playful way that a lot of us talk. Just like at MIT, we use the word hack, right? Like in a very loose sense. But I think what we're realizing is we can't break other aspects of our lives and kind of overweight simply our economic bottom lines. Otherwise, the blowback in terms of public PR, but also maybe our own internal notions of ethics and what we're standing for could be compromised, right? So, you know, so I guess my question, I would just encourage folks to think about whether there are some different kinds of lightweight models. It's not a very radical proposal, in my mind at least, by which we could experiment with other kinds of models of being inclusive, other kinds of models of being transparent, other kinds of models of being transparent, and kind of accountable, right? And I guess the last thing I'll say is the network effects. I didn't mention this. The network effects of having mass amounts of users without necessarily having to be as accountable in terms of our governance of those systems is making a lot of money for Facebook, right? And it probably makes a lot of money at Google. You have a much larger global governance team than Facebook does, which is about 24 people. 24 people for, I don't know how many countries Facebook is, dozens of countries, right? 2+ billion users. If you only invest that amount of money for 24 people to deal with all the global effects of your technologies, you're saying something about what you value there. It means you're massively overprivileging the economic network effects of your technology without necessarily investing in trying to curb some of its potentially pernicious effects. And so I guess all of this, we should put it all on the table. We can make very low-scale investments. Google's an experimental space, experimental company. Why not try it out? Let me help you.
Going on from this idea of governance, I'm interested from your travels, either your travels or like stories from colleagues and stuff like this.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the perception of governments, elected governments, whether they be at a city level like Stockton or country level or even at an EU level, what their thoughts are, what you've experienced around their thoughts around these issues that you've talked about specifically like the sort of ontologies and learning and like the biases that might come from these huge private systems that then are either incorporated directly or their ideas are put into play in these systems. And I'm interested in governments because governments are ultimately, hopefully, theoretically, accountable to their citizens.
Yeah.
What's the intersection looking like there, and what are the opportunities? Like, what are some opportunities to do good that you see are low-hanging fruit?
I think that it's not that great right now. When I kind of go to different parts of the world, the digital divide really shouldn't have ever been framed about access to technology. It was more about the kind of literacy and the opportunity to produce and create technologies in one's own ecosystem. That's what the ultimate divide was. And we should also presume that the mere ability to create technology in a place is somehow beneficial to a place economically or politically. But I think that there are two major strategies that are underway amongst the more kind of, if you will, clued in or ahead of the curve kind of folks that I've seen in different parts of the world. First is to think about how to piggyback off of these large-scale, private technological systems and infrastructures and build local economic and political technological ecosystems on top of it, right? So so that's been pretty successful in places like India, right? You can kind of say, hey, these Google services are there, but we're going to innovate on top of that and try to create systems and technologies and firms that are beneficial to our constituencies. I mean, to be honest, that hasn't fully, to me, that's not like the full way forward, just to be honest. The other idea is to try to build, and this is really interesting, I'll be spending some time in Nairobi this summer, right where Ushahidi was born. I think some of us probably know Ushahidi, and other companies. It turns out, in many parts of the world, I think you all know this, that there are thriving tech incubation communities, and Nairobi is one of the largest, right? And so the question is how do we start to, so I'm seeing that happening in governments, less so the Kenyan government, but the local kind of municipal authorities are supporting that form of growth. But the issue is the access to capital and VC funding. That's been a big issue. So I think what we need to do is pay attention to local innovations and make the idea, and think about the idea that innovation is not something that simply happens when we have seemingly infinite resources, but innovation also happens when we have very little and we got to hustle, right? We just got to like adjust within constraints, right? And you see that in all sorts of parts of the world with what people do, like on the street. Like any of you have been in various parts of the global south. New Delhi, you'll walk through the middle of old parts of New Delhi. People will be resoldering and rejigging phones in front of you and building informal economies off of these systems. So I guess my point is, as much as possible, I'm not seeing a lot of that's that promising, but as much as possible, it would be great if local institutions and government institutions could support kind of other kinds of tech incubations and economies in those parts of the world. I'm hopeful that that happens. I don't see a lot of it, though, right now. But I think in general, just really quick point, in general, I don't see governance officials really understanding technology very significantly. Yeah.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Sure.
Do you want? Okay. Yeah, thanks. Last week at I/O, Google announced Duplex, where we're going to have Google Assistant through algorithms actually communicating directly with humans. And one interesting aspect of this was they train the algorithms, it seems, to actually say ums and mm-hms, one aspect of our culture. Here in the US, when we talk to people casually, built in. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on this specific technology that we're developing, how it'll impact worldwide culturally, and what Google could be doing from your perspective differently to make sure that our impacts are minimized.
I think in general, it would be great if Google could be pretty transparent. It allows me to say something I want to say about kind of what data it's collecting and how it's using that data. I mean, it doesn't have to be too specific, but I think that could be, in general, as these sorts of like useful technologies start to spread in their reach. Now, to directly answer your question, I mean, unless these technologies are, I don't know if it's so much this specifically, but I see this as layered on top of a larger potential problem, which call centers are highly embedded within, which is the idea that based on where the money is and where the customers are, we're going to build protocols around technology that are forced into that logic, right? So what I'm getting at is I actually just assigned a paper in my graduate course this last week about the Americanization of call center workers, right? So we're in call centers, I mean, you all probably heard of this. Like in call centers, folks are taught to take on American or Western identities, to speak American English, and to even learn those forms of speaking that are familiar to all of us. So I think it's really important, obviously, that we don't do the same thing with the technologies that are going to be automated that we're going to spread to other parts of the world. But I think more generally, my larger point is really about a kind of a sense of social responsibility recognizes that not simply in the gathering and acquisition of data and attention, that's not the only way to produce value. That there are other ways of producing value, and we can have a more balanced approach toward that. But to be honest, I'm not an expert on this particular technology. I did see the video, and I, like everyone else, was like wowed by it. It went super viral. David and I were just talking about it. But I think the questions, again, of design and what it means are really central here. So feel free to ask me more about it once I learn more about it as well. Yeah.
All right.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Ramesh.
Thank you.